From 1939 to 1945, thousands of German submarines, the famous U-boats, roamed the Atlantic, suddenly surging up out of the water to sow terror and chaos. Never before in history had any other invention been so highly developed and improved upon, bringing to it such a high degree of technological perfection. The Third Reich would launch armadas of submarines to strike fatal blows to the Allied convoys, cutting off every trade route they had. Their goal was to gain complete control over the ocean and suffocate England. In Winston Churchill's memoirs, written after World War II, he confessed that throughout the conflict, only one single thing ever made him question their eventual victory over Nazi Germany: the submarines. In the Atlantic, the German U-boats were engaged in an incredible battle, a fight to the death that nearly changed the course of the Second World War. The last Type 7 U-boat in history rests on the shores of the Baltic Sea. The U-995 is the only remaining example of the German vessel that played an essential role right from the start of World War II. In mid-August 1939, the U-30 German submarine, commanded by Fritz Julius Lemp, left its home port in Germany. It was headed for the North Atlantic, probably in anticipation of France and England's response to the invasion of Poland, planned for September 1st. 2 days after Germany invaded Poland, France and Great Britain declared war on the Third Reich. That same day at around 9 p.m., the U-30, which was located some 370 kilometers north of the Hebrides, identified a ship that was zigzagging with no lights. It was the Athenia ocean liner from the Donaldson Company, which was theoretically protected by the laws of war. But Fritz Julius Lemp deemed it to be a merchant vessel armed with cannons. He fired 2 torpedoes at his target. The explosion lit up the ocean. The furnace room had taken a direct hit. The ship quickly sank below the waves, stern first. 112 of the 1,428 people on board died that night. This incident marked the beginning of World War II on and below the sea.
The Germans have prepared themselves particularly well for this kind of all-out war, in part by perfecting a submarine that would be one of the best of World War II, the Type 7 submarine, right under the Allies' noses in secret, despite the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, which had been signed at the end of World War I.
Here are the specifications of the Type 7 submarine from 1941 to 1943. Length, more than 67 meters. Beam, more than 6 meters. Average draft, 4.7 meters. Displacement when submerged, 871 tons. Type 7 submarines featured saddle tanks. The ends, the ballast tanks, and the superstructure of the bridge along with the conning tower railings were welded to the hull. Maximum diameter of the hull, nearly 5 meters. Thickness of the pressure hull, 18.5 to 21.5 millimeters. The pressurized hull of the Type 7 submarines was divided into 6 compartments. The forward torpedo room, the forward battery compartment, then the control room, with the conning tower up above it. This is where the captain remained during attacks.
The U-boats were not submarines in the sense that we think of them today, in that they were not continually underwater. Most of the time, often at night, they remained at the surface so they could continue using their diesel engines, which recharged their batteries and allowed them to navigate when submerged. They only went fully underwater to attack or when they themselves were under attack.
In the center were the living quarters with the galley. The second battery compartment was located in the hold. Finally, there was the diesel compartment, then the aft torpedo room. 2 electric motors were also located there. The main ballast was divided into 5 reservoirs, 2 in the ends in the external hull, 2 in the saddle tanks, and 1 in the pressure hull. 3 reservoirs that could be used to store fuel were located below the bridge of the third compartment. Weapons: 5 533mm torpedo launchers. Ammo: 14 torpedoes. The G7 electric torpedo, which the German submarines nicknamed the Eel, was developed in 1929. Its design was so perfect that it continued to be produced until 1944. The final versions were self-guided and equipped with a combustion system inside the launcher that enabled the engine to travel up to 7.5 kilometers at a speed of 55 kilometers per hour. In September 1940, less than 1 year after the sinking of the Athenia and the bitter setback of the French campaign, England was left fighting Hitler on its own. The country had nothing left. The survival of the British depended on supply convoys sent from Canada and the US. It was these convoys that the U-boats were determined to send to the bottom of the ocean. In order to reach Liverpool, the convoys had to travel 5,635 kilometers from New York, 4,600 kilometers from Halifax, or 8,389 kilometers from the Panama Canal. They were at sea from anywhere from 14 to 19 days, which was plenty of time for them to be intercepted and sunk, especially since in July 1940, after the invasion of France, U-boats started mooring in Brest, La Rochelle, Saint-Nazaire, and Lorient, their headquarters. It was open season on the Allied convoys. Dozens of U-boats would soon be crisscrossing the sea off the coast of France. These impressive forces were commanded by an expert, Admiral Karl Donitz.
Karl Donitz was an experienced submarine commander. He had carried out many successful operations in the Mediterranean during World War I. Right from the start, as early as 1935, he had a significant impact on the development of the German submarine fleet.
Admiral Donitz had just 57 U-boats at his disposal when the hostilities began. Yet even that was enough to attack the convoys, which were often poorly guarded.
People donated yachts, and we painted these, some rich man's yacht gray, put a gun on it and a few depth charges, and they had to play the role of escort.
But time was running out if the Germans wanted to quickly assert complete control over the Atlantic. With help from the United States, England was starting to get organized.
On September 2, 1940, the United States and England signed an accord that allowed the Royal Navy the use of 50 destroyers to protect the convoys. In response to this agreement, in October 1940, Karl Donitz instituted a tactic he explained in a book published in 1935, the U-Boat Commander's Manual, which called for U-boats to attack the convoys in packs.
The strategy assigned each submarine to a specific location. The group would then work together to form a barrier cutting off the convoy's potential path. With the U-boats spaced approximately every 20 nautical miles, the cargo ships theoretically had very little chance of escaping detection. Information on their location and heading could also be obtained through radio and aerial reconnaissance. All the relevant details were sent to a single center of operations, responsible for coordinating the actions of the group and rallying any nearby submarines. Once a U-boat had discovered its prey, it transmitted its position to the center and continued following it at a safe distance. Because of the shape of the convoys, attacking from the flank was not very effective. One of the best German U-boat commanders, Otto Kretschmer, who was just 28 years old in 1940, devised two other tactics. He would position his U-boat at the back of the convoy, come up to the surface, then penetrate into the formation. Once he was in the middle of the cargo ships, he launched his torpedoes, dived back down to let the ships pass him, then did it all over again. His second technique consisted of placing the submarine at the front of the convoy. He could then dive down and remain underwater until he was under the middle of the convoy before launching his torpedoes. U-boat commanders such as Fritz Julius Lemp and Otto Kretschmer were quickly awarded hero status by the propaganda of the Third Reich. They were popular public figures, celebrated like knights of the oceans. Captain Engelbert Endras, who took down the HMS Royal Oak in 1939 and dozens of transport ships in 1940, even went on a mission with the Reich propaganda operator. The U-boats and their teams served as inspiration. Yet Hitler's favorites remained the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, two destroyers that had done very little in the battle for the Atlantic at this point.
The Fuhrer changed his tune when he realized how useful the submarines could be.
On October 17, 1940, the U-38 U-boat located the SC-7 convoy. The submarine sent its coordinates to Donitz's headquarters in Lorient. They were immediately transmitted to all submarines patrolling in the area. Over the course of the next day, the pack would attack 3 cargo ships. Meanwhile, the only escort ship, the British HMS Scarborough, received backup from 2 sloops and 2 corvettes. The conditions on the night of October 18th to 19th were ideal for the submarine predators. The moon was full and the sea was calm. At around 9 p.m., the U-46 fired 4 torpedoes on 2 cargo ships. A corvette quickly moved out to track the attacker, but also distanced itself by several kilometers, leaving the convoy without protection. The U-101 seized its chance to fire its torpedoes on another one of the transport ships.
Germans are very smart. They wait till nighttime, and then at nighttime they bring up the submarine on the surface. So the sonar is not so good when you're on the surface. So then they would pick a ship, pick a tank, an oil tanker, go boom, and it'd be massive flames, and all crew would be dead in seconds. So that's how they lit up the whole convoy. I saw a ship going up like that, yeah. And I'll never forget it. You think, oh my God, there's about 40 or 50 guys just gone. Another terrible sight I saw was when a ship carrying iron ore, when she was torpedoed, went right down. No chance to send a message or anything, just right down. Because the ore is so heavy, when the torpedo opens up the side of the ship to a great water pouring in, it just takes the ship right down.
At around 10 p.m., the U-99, under the command of Otto Kretschmer, fired its opening salvo of torpedoes. The Empire Miniver kicked up to its maximum speed, but that wouldn't be enough to save it. One of Kretschmer's torpedoes hit the engine room, and the ship lost power and started sinking rapidly. The escort ships quickly maneuvered among the scattering cargo ships in an attempt to bring them back together. Meanwhile, the U-99 returned to the center of the formation and hit the convoy ships point blank without even bothering to aim. This is how Kretschmer described the events in his captain's log. 10:30 p.m., we fired with the front launcher at a heavily loaded transport ship. The torpedo missed, but hit an even larger one weighing 7,000 tons. It sank prow first. 11:55 p.m. We fired a torpedo against a bulk freighter. Direct hit. The prow section was destroyed as far back as the bridge. 12:15 a.m. I hear constant explosions of torpedoes being fired by our subs. The destroyers are moving at full speed, and the shells explode from time to time, but in vain. 1:38 a.m. We fired with the front torpedo launcher. The torpedo hit. The ship sank. 1:55 a.m. We fired. The torpedo hit. The ship sank in 40 seconds. At around midnight, the Assyrian cargo ship, which had the counter-admiral of the convoy on board, detected a German submarine directly in front of it, just 90 meters away. In an attempt to ram it, the steamship powered ahead at max speed. It missed and found itself far from the convoy without protection. At 1:22 a.m., alone, it was hit by a torpedo. At around 5 in the morning, the U-29 used its artillery to finish off the Clintonia transport ship, which had been abandoned by its crew. The artillerymen were so enthusiastic, they nearly fired on Kretschmer's U-99. At dawn, the submarines left, having sunk 20 cargo ships and damaged 6 more. Dozens of men were missing.
That's another bad thing. When ships got torpedoed and the oil tanks were opened up and there was oil all over the place and men were covered in oil. Very bad. Some people didn't survive because the accommodation collapsed and they were stuck inside and they couldn't get out. Yeah.
The following night, the HX-79 convoy was navigating through the same zone. It was composed of 49 transport ships and 12 escorts. Despite the convoy's fairly robust defenses, 5 German U-boats still managed to sink 12 of its ships in a matter of a few hours. In just 3 days, the Germans had crushed 2 Allied convoys without losing a single submarine. On October 25, 1940, Donitz met with Hitler. He wanted to convince him to make U-boats the backbone of German naval strategy in the Atlantic. Hitler didn't need much convincing. The extraordinary success of the most recent attacks was all it took to persuade the Führer. The construction of new submarines was accelerated, as was the building of their bases, which consumed 1/4 of the concrete produced in France over the course of the occupation. It was time for a response. England would soon benefit from some fortuitous aid. In March 1941, the United States Congress passed the Lend-Lease Law, which went into action immediately.
Thanks to the Lend-Lease Law, the U.S. government would be able to sell astronomical amounts of food, military supplies, and raw materials to England on credit, all of which would be transported in immense convoys from the American coast to the English coast. These convoys would need to be protected.
As a result, small vessels were specially created in England and Canada, which was part of the British territories at the time, to keep the cargo ships safe. These bodyguards were the Flower-class corvettes such as the Sackville, which is still moored in the port of Halifax, Canada, nearly 80 years after its exploits. The main defining features of the Sackville Flower-class corvette were as follows. Standard displacement, 950 tons. Length, 62.5 meters. Beam, 10 meters. Draft, 3.5 meters. Weapons, one 102mm Mk14 cannon. Anti-aircraft weaponry, 2 Lewis twin machine guns, and 1 QF 2-pounder Mark 8, known as Pom-Pom. Anti-submarine weaponry, 4 Mk2 depth charge throwers and 2 depth charge rails with 40 depth charges. Main engine, a 2,750 horsepower steam engine. Maximum cruising speed, 30 kilometers per hour. Autonomy, 5,632 kilometers at a speed of 22 kilometers per hour. Crew, 85 people. These new escort ships were all the more efficient as they were equipped with the first radar systems. It was thanks to these that the Allies pulled off their first victories. Fritz Julius Lemp, who had sank the Athenia, was killed in the middle of the Atlantic in March 1941. Otto Kretschmer was captured south of Iceland just a few weeks later. But that wasn't enough to turn the tide. In April 1941, the German U-boats once again sank nearly 700,000 tons of Allied merchant ships, setting a new record.
But in spring 1941, one event would change the course of the first part of the war in the Atlantic Ocean.
That May, a German submarine was making the crossing from the coast of Iceland to that of Greenland. It was the U-110, Type 9 U-boat. The German submarine had just sunk 2 cargo ships, but had also been damaged by several depth charges. It was forced to make an emergency return to the surface, and its crew, which was under fire, abandoned it without being able to scuttle it first. Inside, the English sailors found an Enigma machine.
The Enigma machine was a portable electromechanical device that was used to encrypt internal messages from the Kriegsmarine. In 1938 and 1939, the French and the Polish managed to break the code of the Enigma machine, thanks to a mole in the German intelligence agency. But at this point in time, the British did not yet believe that the French and the Polish had succeeded, and they remained highly skeptical. In May 1941, they were happy to continue the work of the French and the Polish, and were soon able to start decrypting the coded messages from the Germans themselves.
In the second half of 1941, the English were able to decode the German communications, allowing them to reroute the convoys to avoid the U-boats. The British may have succeeded in finding respite on the Atlantic front, but the German submarines still ruled the Mediterranean. In November 1941, the U-331 U-boat was marauding off the coast of Egypt. It had been the first German submarine to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar that previous September. It was commanded by Baron Hans Dietrich von Tiesenhausen, who was 30 years old and the descendant of one of the oldest families of Germano-Baltic nobility. That day, the U-331 came across the HMS Barham, an Elizabeth-class battleship measuring 196 meters long. Once it was within 700 meters of its target, the German submarine fired 4 torpedoes. 3 of them hit their target, causing a massive explosion. 862 men of the crew died as the ship went down.
The loss of the Barham was so serious that the British Admiralty concealed the information. First, because they didn't want the Germans to know that they had sunk it. Second, to avoid bringing down British morale. The families of the victims were informed, but they were asked not to share the information, which wasn't officially announced until much later.
At this point, only 2 English battleships remained in the Mediterranean, the Queen Elizabeth and the Valiant, operating out of the port of Alexandria in Egypt. The U-boats had virtually free rein. They boarded and searched the merchant ships, confiscating the cargo, and sank them without hesitation. The German corsairs didn't pull any punches.
In late December 1941, the English supply routes in the Mediterranean and off the coast of northern Africa and Egypt had been severely disrupted. Access to the Suez Canal was a matter of life or death. A considerable number of commercial ships were pillaged and sunk by the Kriegsmarine. Fortunately for the English, the United States joined the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor.
At the end of 1941, the United States Maritime Commission designed a new type of commercial ship that could be built quickly, cheaply, and in large numbers. The class of ship designed to be used for the Atlantic convoys was immediately christened Liberty. The Liberty ships were assembled out of parts and modules that had been prefabricated all over the United States, then sent to the shipyards. They were like giant erector sets.
The Liberty ships were built at an impressive pace. The first was assembled in just 5 months in 1941. By 1943, 2 years later, the average time it took to build each ship was just 39 days. And in 1942, the workers at the American shipyards set a new record by assembling and launching a Liberty ship in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes.
The Liberty ships quickly gained respect for their simple design, which made it possible to build a massive fleet of transport vessels in a very short period of time for an incredible return on investment. A cargo of 260 M4 Sherman tanks represented $12 million worth of freight. With an assembly cost of just $2 million, the Liberty ships often transported goods worth much more than the vessels themselves, thus paying for the cost of their construction. The battle for the Atlantic was also being fought in the shipyards. In Germany, 199 U-boats were built over the course of 1941. 238 were launched in 1942. Even at a rate of 1 lost submarine per month, by January 1942, Admiral Donitz knew that he now had an impressive fleet. He could try to annihilate the convoys in order to win the battle for the Atlantic. It was a simple equation. If the U-boats could sink an average of 600,000 tons of British merchant ships per month, then Great Britain would be unable to renew its fleet. In early 1942, the U-boats were once again crisscrossing the Atlantic freely, because the Kriegsmarine had added new rotors to the Enigma machine. The encoded German radio messages could no longer be decrypted by the Allies, who had lost all control.
At that point, the Allies had no way of knowing their enemy's intentions. The U-boat's domination was so complete that the Germans even launched a vast submarine operation against the east coast of the United States.
During Operation Pockenschlag, U-boats approached the coast of New York and American beaches to attack cargo ships that were navigating without any protection. The preys were all the easier as the Type 7 submarines had been considerably modernized. These U-boats were originally equipped with 88mm SKC-35 cannons. But due to changes in combat style, anti-aircraft weapons were being installed on Type 7 subs as early as 1942. U-995 featured the following elements: a 37mm flak M42U cannon and two 20mm automatic flak 38 cannons. It was propelled by two diesel engines totaling 3,200 horsepower, two electric engines with 750 horsepower each, and two sets of accumulator batteries, each composed of 62 pieces. The powertrain had been redesigned to free up 11.5 tons of displacement. As a result, the engineers were able to increase the thickness of the pressure hulls, which allowed them to increase the operating depth to 120 meters and the maximum depth to 300 meters. The vessel was equipped with a special system that allowed its diesel engine to function underwater: a snorkel. Max speed at the surface, 31 kilometers per hour. Max speed below the surface, 14 kilometers per hour. Field of action at the surface, 13,680 kilometers at 18 kilometers per hour. Underwater, 129 kilometers at 7 kilometers per hour. Autonomy, 40 days.
In order to cross the Atlantic from the European coast, some Type 7 submarines decided to sacrifice some of their drinking water and replace it with fuel. But most of the time, they were resupplied on the high seas by Type 14 cruising submarines, transformed into tankers, which the Germans called Mikakur, or milk cows, that could carry 432 tons of fuel, ammo such as torpedoes, and fresh food kept in refrigerators.
From December 1941 to August 1942, the Kriegsmarine took advantage of the weakness and disorganization of the American defense system, which didn't yet have enough battleships and had even fewer experienced sailors.
It was devastating along the coast. As a matter of fact, we had to sail independently from port to port to port. And one day, just to give you some indication how treacherous it was, in the spring of 1942, during the daylight hours in sight of American land, I counted 14 ships laying on the ocean floor. So that's what the scenario was like along the American coast in 1942.
The German submarines were so successful that they referred to this period as the Happy Days, or more cynically, the hunt for the American turkey.
At this point in the war, despite the incredible rate at which Liberty ships were being built, the Germans were still sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them, which meant that the English supply routes were on the brink of collapse. An English defeat was entirely possible if the destruction continued at such a high rate.
The U-boats sank more than 1,000 ships off the coast of North America, all the way up to the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada. They sank more than 5 million tons in just 8 months. Yet the escort ships, most of them Canadian, put up a valiant fight. Engelbert Endras, filmed here in September 1941, died at age 30 with his entire crew. The U-567 he was commanding was hit by a depth charge in the middle of the Atlantic. His death affected Donitz, who realized the Allied escort ships were rising in power. The Sackville corvette was a perfect illustration of this gradual overturning of the balance of power. In August, it was escorting the ON-115 convoy from New York when it was attacked by two Kriegsmarine Wolfpacks off the coast of Newfoundland. One of the submarines, the U-552, was commanded by Eric Topp, who was just 28 in 1942, and one of the submarine sub-officers with the most medals and also the most photographed in World War II. His U-boat, which had a distinctive red devil painted on its conning tower, sank 13 ships in the first half of 1942 and didn't hesitate to turn its machine guns on the rescue boats. He was formidable and without mercy.
I wasn't afraid of submarines because I could not see them. You didn't know they were there until bang!
In August 1942, alone and without air support due to intense fog, the Sackville detected the U-43 German submarine at the surface. It caused substantial damage with its depth charges while the submarine was going underwater. The next day, the corvette attacked another submarine, the U-704, as it was diving to attack a convoy. The U-boat had to beat a hasty retreat. A few hours later, the corvette detected the U-552, which would not escape unscathed. A 4-inch shell from the Sackville hit its conning tower, and after it went below the surface, the corvette launched a depth charge. The submarine commanded by Eric Topp miraculously survived the damage and managed to return to Saint-Nazaire. The determination of the crew of the Sackville was a major factor in the convoy losing just 2 of its 41 ships.
In October 1942, the Allies were once again able to decode the messages of the U-boats, and that had consequences. Because the Kriegsmarines started suffering more and more losses, the situation turned around in a matter of just a few months.
Germany managed to once again destroy 800,000 tons of Allied merchant ships in November 1942. It was the most efficient month of the entire war for the U-boats. However, it was also the beginning of the end. The winds were starting to change. As a symbol of this turnaround, the U-331, captained by Commander Tiesenhausen, who had taken down the Barham in 1941, was sunk on November 17, 1942, north of Algiers, after a strong aerial attack orchestrated by the British Admiralty that had been tracking it for months. In January 1943, Donitz was appointed head of the Kriegsmarine. The Fuhrer was finally making underwater warfare a priority.
Hitler made a mistake by forcing Donitz to maintain a certain number of submarines off the coast of Norway and in the Mediterranean, when he should have sent them all to the Atlantic instead.
In March 1943, the aerial coverage of the British-American convoys continued. The 4-engine B-24 Liberators taking off from England were now able to travel more than 3,300 kilometers. Several American escort aircraft carriers were also sent to the Atlantic.
The loss of the underwater war didn't happen suddenly. It was a gradual development, but it all happened in a fairly short period of time. All these different measures came together to great effect. In May 1943, the Allies sank more German submarines in one day than all the transport ships they had lost.
By April 1943, the Allied losses decreased by 50% in the North Atlantic. The Allied shipyards were running at full speed, producing more than 1 million tons per month. The merchant fleet available for war transport was starting to increase. The yield was so high that by late 1943, all the losses since the start of the conflict had been replaced. This frenzied rate of production took Admiral Donitz by surprise.
In terms of absolute value, Admiral Donit's math was correct, but only in terms of absolute value. Why? Because he hadn't expected the Allies to be able to perfect methods and develop anti-submarine technology so much faster than Nazi Germany could build its U-boats.
The turning point of the battle is generally considered to be the offensive against the ONS-5 convoy. On April 22, 1943, 43 cargo vessels protected by 7 escort ships left Liverpool for Halifax in Canada. The ONS-5 convoy was attacked by 2 Wolfpacks, with a combined total of 43 U-boats. The Allied escorts lost 12 ships, but they also sank 7 German submarines and damaged just as many. The following 3 convoys lost 7 ships, but the Germans also paid a heavy price. 7 U-boats were sunk. Finally, 37 cargo ships of the SC-130 convoy left Halifax on May 11th and reached Liverpool intact on May 26 after fighting off the attacks of Donitz's Grey Wolves and sinking 3 of them. "43 U-boats were lost in a single month. The submariners' morale was at an all-time low. They were exhausted. The happy days were over. Many commanders were now hesitant to pursue any offensives apart from simple surprise attacks. On May 24, 1943, Donitz decided to pull his submarines out of the North Atlantic.
The possibility of defeating England by cutting off its supply routes, which was still plausible just a few months earlier, was looking less and less likely, especially because the Americans had introduced more effective naval strategies to fight the submarines. Most notably, groups of hunter-killers centered on escort carriers, which were being built by the dozen in American shipyards at the time.
Starting in the summer of 1943, groups of hunter-killers would be organized around a single escort aircraft carrier and several destroyers charged with protecting it from attacks such as those by enemy submarines. They set out from the United States or North America and were assigned specific zones to survey. Once they reached their destinations, they had free rein to organize chases to help the escorts of convoys under threat or simply patrol sectors where a pack had been spotted. In just 3 months in 1943, the efforts of these hunter-killer groups was so successful that for each ship destroyed by submarine torpedoes, they destroyed some 15 U-boats. In August 1943, Portugal agreed to let the Allies establish their bases in the Azores, thus improving aerial coverage of the convoys even more. The aircraft even covered sectors where U-boats could previously recharge their batteries at the surface in relative safety. At the same time, on September 13, 1943, Admiral Donitz sent his submarines back to the North Atlantic once again. These submarines featured new equipment, including anti-aircraft guns, radar detectors, and acoustic G7 torpedoes. which could follow the sounds emitted by the propellers of Allied ships more than 7 kilometers away.
These acoustic torpedoes were hard on the Allies' morale, but they quickly came up with a solution. They started towing noise-making decoys designed by the Royal Canadian Navy to deflect the torpedoes away from their targets.
By late 1943, several U-boats were equipped with snorkels that enabled them to stay submerged with a periscope in place, allowing them to resupply the diesel engines with the air they needed. These devices made it possible for the submarines to travel at a normal speed and recharge their batteries while remaining discreetly underwater. But even these innovations weren't enough to slow the erosion of the reign of the U-boats. On June 6, 1944, when the Allies set a foot on the beaches of Normandy, not a single German submarine was able to counter the operation or perform a single raid on the Allied Armada's ships. In October of the same year, the Allies took back control of the French coasts, and the German U-boats were forced to fall back to Norway or the Baltic. They no longer had access to their immense naval bases on the Atlantic coast. Yet the German engineers innovated once again. Towards the end of 1944, a new model of submarine was put into operation, the Type 21 Unterseeboot, known as Elektroboot, which was the most powerful submarine in the conflict in terms of offensive force, depth, and diving speed. It operated silently, making it nearly impossible to detect. It would influence all future submarines around the world.
The German engineers had come up with a propulsion system that needed no oxygen. The Walker turbine allowed the Unterseeboot 21 to stay underwater for days or even weeks at a time.
In addition to the innovations in the design of the Elektroboot, the German engineers had also come up with an idea that would mark a radical change in how modern submarines were used. This revolutionary concept, intended for use on attacks against the United States, consisted of giving U-boats the ability to fire a V-2 ballistic missile from the ocean towards the continent. The German engineers had just laid the foundations for what would become one of the most powerful war machines of all time. But in December 1944, the Allies placed mines all over the Baltic Sea, the last gateway to the oceans for the German submarines. It was no longer an option. The Type 21 had arrived too late to change the results of the war. The Reich lost the battle for the Atlantic and surrendered on May 8, 1945. Eric Topp turned himself in on May 9, 1945, with his Type 21, the U-2513.
German admiral had been instructed by the Allies that all German submarines were to come to the surface, fly a black flag, and proceed to the nearest Allied base. That was the idea. The message came telling our squadron commander to take the 5 Canadian ships and intercept. There were 15 German submarines proceeding south. So we closed in on these German submarines, and we sent one of our officers to the senior German officer. So anyway, they obeyed, and we escorted these 15 German U-boats to Loch Arabal, Scotland. A lot of people had never seen a U-boat. You know, oh, maybe they saw just a little bit of one. And suddenly 15.
The fate of the surviving submarines was sealed by the Allies during the Potsdam Conference. From November 1945 to January 1946, not far from Scotland, during Operation Deadlight, more than 100 German submarines were destroyed by either explosive charges or artillery fire. Of the 1,154 U-boats ever built, 863 were in service. They sank 2,775 Allied ships, representing more than 14 million tons. 743 were lost in operations. Some 30,000 submariners perished at sea.